And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hi, this is Drew Perkins. Thanks again for tuning in to the Teach Thought podcast. I'm your host and director of Teach Thought Professional Development. A couple of housekeeping and announcement notes. Some of you no doubt have been following the Reading Wars and Emily Hanford's Sold a Story podcast, and on January 2nd, we are going to be hosting a live podcast with Emily Hanford and Natalie Wexler, who has been a guest on the podcast, and her work around knowledge and literacy and reading instruction has been an important part of that discussion as well. And joining us as well will be Mickey Ray, who is the Chief Academic Officer of the Kentucky Department of Education and a literacy specialist, as well as Kate Wynn, who is a teacher in Canada who has moved from more of a balanced literacy approach to one that is probably best described as more of a structured literacy. So we're going to host this live podcast with registration opening soon, and folks will be able to ask questions. The exact format is still being figured out, but that will happen on January 2nd at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We're also in the midst of planning a return of our summer PBL Grow event. This one, of course, will be PBL Grow 23. So look for details on that. We'll probably open up registration in January. And we've got some great guests coming up on our podcast as well, so stay tuned for that. Thanks as always for listening, and I encourage you to share with folks who you might think would find value in this conversation or any of our podcast conversations. And of course, our professional development work. And if you need to reach out to me directly, my email is drew@teachthought.com. In this episode, I spoke with Paul Kirschner, who might best be described as a researcher and publisher in the area of cognitive psychology, and especially in the realm of teaching and learning. If you've been following the debates and arguments around the science of learning, you're probably familiar with Paul and his work. He is a staunch advocate for what he would call good instruction, but is often referred to as explicit or sometimes direct instruction. So it was an interesting conversation for me to explore some of the complexity and nuance and tensions between inquiry teaching and what he advocates for. As usual, I try to find some common ground, and I think there's significant common ground. So we talked about the purpose of school and the purpose of his latest two books with some co-authors, How Learning Happens and How Teaching Happens, which I would recommend all teachers take a look at because they are certainly a good resource and plenty there to dive into and think more about and ask questions about. A lot of the framing that he uses is through the lens of efficient, effective, and enjoyable. So we explored some of the tensions there and the ways in which people think about the purpose of education and prioritization of knowledge and academic success. And of course, many of the tensions between what might be called traditional versus progressive teaching. Again, I'm always looking to have conversations with people who might think differently and try to find common ground so that we can actually do a better job of teaching our students to be better prepared for the modern world. And I hope this conversation is helpful in pursuit of that. One additional note I wanted to add is that in preparation for this conversation, the publishers sent me an extra copy of one of Paul Kirschner's books. That is How Learning Happens, and their loss is your benefit, and they have authorized me to use it as a book giveaway for listeners of this podcast. If you would like to enter your name for a chance to get this book sent to you free of charge, all you have to do is the following. Head on over to Twitter and tweet a quote or phrase from this discussion that I had with Paul, and include a link to the podcast on WeGrowTeachers.com. And tag TeachThoughtPD, which is @TeachThoughtPD. what we'll do is take a look at all of those folks who did that, throw your name in a hat, and draw a number. And if you are chosen, we will send you a message and get that address and send the book your way. The deadline to get this tweet sent out is December 21st, 2022, so a week from our publishing date. Thanks for spreading the word, and best of luck. All right, I'm here with Paul Kirschner, and I'm happy to have him on and have a conversation about his work and some of the things that we think about with education. And I'm going to give Paul, as I like to do, an opportunity to introduce himself and give a little bio so that folks know who they're listening to if they're not aware of Paul. So, Paul, go ahead and do that if you would.
Okay, here in the Netherlands, I'm known as Paul Kirschner and not Paul Kirschner, but I was born in the United States, so I guess I'm both. It really doesn't matter. I've lived in the Netherlands for 50 years. I came here as a hippie because I was frustrated being a teacher and decided I needed to go somewhere else to get my head together. Came to the Netherlands, what was supposed to be a year, and that was in 1973. It's now 2022, almost 2023, so it's almost 50 years. I'm a Dutch citizen. I got my master's and my PhD in the Netherlands on dealing with educational psychology, primarily how people learn and how we can do things with learning materials, written learning materials, what a teacher does, all different, it doesn't matter the medium, it's about how it's organized, how it's set up, the psychology behind how people learn. I've been doing that since in my master's, which was around 1977. So I've been doing that also for quite a long time. I'm now an emeritus professor, which means I'm retired. I'm an author. I write blogs. I write books for teachers that they can understand, to kind of help them understand not what to do, but why things that they might do might work or might not work, in which situations. Will they work or won't they work? Kind of like you teach a doctor anatomy, physiology, pathology, so that she or he knows what to expect when she or he chooses for a way of dealing with sickness. Well, I try to do that, and not that learning is a sickness, but with the teachers, that they not only know what to do, but they understand why they could do it, should do it, how it works. Things like that. I call myself a grumpy old man or an educational realist. It depends upon the time of day and what my mood is.
Right. Okay. And the books that you have most recently authored are How Learning Happens, which is 2020, and that's with Carl Hendrick. And then How Teaching Happens, which is 2022, also with Carl Hendrick and Jim Heel. And I was able to take a look at both of those, and very interesting works. So seminal works in education and educational psychology and teacher effectiveness and putting them in practice. And so I don't remember how many there are, but there's just a large number of sort of, I guess, studies that you're looking at and sort of unpacking and saying, here's how you can put it into practice and here's why it's important. And it is, as I looked at it and as I was reading it, I found it to be really, really interesting. And of course, one of the things that I'm sure you're aware of and listeners must be aware of is that, especially on the internet, everything's a fight, right? Everything is, I'm right, you're wrong. And one of the things that I have been wrestling with and trying to get to is some of the complexity and nuance around how we teach and how students learn, which I think that whether you agree with Paul or not, that looking at these books and looking at these studies would be a wonderful exercise in thinking about how we teach and learn effectively. And so, what I wanted to do, and I appreciate you coming on to kind of talk about some of those sort of complexities and nuances around education, and direct and explicit instruction being one of those sort of camps, if you will, and sort of inquiry and that end of the sort of spectrum being another piece of that spectrum, and again some of those complexities. But I guess maybe it's helpful, or it seems like it would be helpful for me and hopefully the listeners to kind of get some things in place as far as how you think about education. What do you think the purpose of school and teaching is? One of the things you talk about a lot, I think, or you reference in the book and in your work, it seems, is sort of the idea of efficiency and doing things that are most efficient. So how do you view those things, and how would you define, sort of the purpose of school and what we're trying to accomplish?
Let me just get a few things, put a few things in proper perspective.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing is neither of the books talk about how you should teach. They talk about what goes on in your head. And that's, it would sound maybe pedantic if I say it's indisputable, but it's fairly indisputable that we have a sensory memory, a working memory, and a long-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of whatever way we choose to teach, that we have to optimize for your working memory, because it's rather small and limited. We know that since 1956.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like, let's argue about the relativity theory or the wave or particle theory of physics. Those things happen. And the second step is what you do with it. So those two books are, I wouldn't call them undisputed truths, but those are 58 seminal articles from two different fields of study, dealing with what happens in our head, what happens in the classroom when we do certain things. Okay? Again, it's not a how-to book. It's a why, how, and when book. So that if you as a teacher, as a reflective practitioner, think about what you're planning to do with what age group, in what course, with how many children, etc., that you can think about it in a way that you say, okay, this might work, this might not work, and because of this. And if you've done something during the day and it turns out that either it worked well or it didn't work well, that you have the knowledge to think about it, why it might not have worked, instead of attributing it to, the kids didn't want to work along or they were lazy or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to think about it, that's what this gives you the equipment to do. So again, although I myself am a cognitive psychologist, I would never say the only way to learn is this, that, or the other, because certain things you can do very behavioristically. If you want to automate the times tables or the addition tables, that's the best way.
Mm-hmm.
If you want people to solve problems and things like that, the best way is a cognitive point of view. And if you want them to work in teams, you have to think about how people work together and give them the ability to do that. Mm-hmm. So it's not from only one area, although I'm often pigeonholed into it, because it's about, for me as a cognitive psychologist, what happens in someone's head when she or he is processing information to learn. Okay, that's number one.
Right.
The second aspect is, you said efficiency. That's one of my three parts of my holy trinity. I say everything that we do should be efficient, effective, and enjoyable. Efficient means you get that done in the amount of time that you have to do it. And if you want to make it more efficient, you can either have it done more quickly, or get it done more quickly, but it can also be that it makes the least amount of necessary use of working memory space, which gives you more room in your working memory to do other things. So that's efficiency with respect to your working memory. I say it's also effective, and that means you achieve what you want to achieve. It's that simple.
Right.
And if you want to make it more effective, you either want to learn or teach more, because I look at it from both sides of the coin, from the teacher side of the view of the coin and the learner side of the coin. But it could also mean, if you want it to be more effective, is that you learn more deeply. Yeah, not just surface level learning, but deeper learning, transfer, things like that. Okay, so that's making it more effective. And enjoyable means that you have a feeling of success, of accomplishment. That at the end of the day, as a teacher or as a learner, you have the idea as a teacher, hey, it worked. That kid that I could never get really in touch with and who really had a lot of problem learning, I can now get in touch with her or him and help that child to learn. And as a learner, you have the idea at the end of the day, hey, I can now do something that I couldn't do earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be solving a math problem. It could be doing a expressionist painting, playing Midnight Rambler, whatever. Yeah, that type of thing. So it's effective, efficient, and enjoyable. And we want to make it effective for the teacher. He or she should know what and why and how something happens. You want to make it more efficient, that there's not all this extra, like one horse more. You know the song One Trick Pony?
Yeah.
From Paul Simon?
Yeah.
Yeah? That talks about, it's about being efficient, just like you're not being a one-trick pony as a teacher, but it's getting the moves down so that you're not expanding extra energy and time on things that don't help the learning process.
Right.
And enjoyable. I want a teacher to drive or bicycle or walk home at the end of the day whistling, and with the idea of, hey, it was really a good day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my whole impetus of the things that I write and things that I do. I'm no longer a practicing experimental psychologist. I'm now writing books and blogs and things like that to make teachers aware of what they can do, why they should or could do it, what its effects could or should be, with whom, so that they can make better choices in what they're doing. So that's the whole thing.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things, and as I was talking or tweeting with, which is not the same as talking, but let's just use talking as a proxy there, right? Tweeting with and talking with folks about talking with you and trying to, again, try to get some of this complexity and nuance. And I'm so disinterested in sort of, quote unquote, fighting with people about these things, but trying to figure out what is best for teachers and kids and education, right? People say, well, you shouldn't, somebody even said, you shouldn't talk to Paul, which was bizarre, right? Like, why would I not talk with him? And, they say, well, he's living in years gone past and, sort of education is passed him by, which doesn't make sense to me because cognitive psychology doesn't, it is fairly timeless. Obviously, we update things as we get more knowledge and understanding, but there are some things that we know that have been in place, and working memory being one, for quite some time, right? So that is not something that we haven't been able to update or whatever that might be. But one of the things the other thing that in it, the idea of enjoyable is, I wonder how you feel, or if you get a sense of tension there between what that really means. Enjoyable for the student and teacher in the learning
enjoyable
process
doesn't necessarily mean fun.
Right. But I understand that as well. So I often say to people, it's like, if fun is your main target, then that's probably not a good idea. Fun is great, right? And I don't think you'd argue with that. But enjoyable, interesting, sort of intellectually nourishing, all of those kinds of things, right?
Giving you a feeling of accomplishment that I can do something.
Right.
I mean,
but then there's, sort of a mindset of, if I were to put, and I talk about this sort of a spectrum of, more traditional education, sort of the strawman version of that, drill and kill, lecture, assess, blah, blah, blah. And the other end, discovery learning, free school, that kind of mindset. And so in between, we have lots of space here, but I would say that a sort of more humanistic idea of education feels like there's some tension between that version of education and mindset and what you're talking about and advocating for, insofar as efficiency and learning being such a high priority. And of course, there are some other things, right? Like humanitarian or the idea that, we want students to enjoy the process and that we're trying to build, great human beings, not just learners, right?
If I was going to give you now an online lecture, I'd tell you how I taught my 4-year-old granddaughter, how to cross the road. Yeah, at a busy intersection in the city of Utrecht. And I'd spend 5 minutes explaining to you how we did that. Yeah, and at the end of it, I'd say, "Now, this was in incredibly interactive. There's quite a lot of dialogue. There was a lot of Q&A. My granddaughter was enjoying it the whole time. And at the end of the day, she had this feeling like, hey, I'm a big girl, I can cross the road. And what I did was pure explicit instruction, according to Barak Rosenshine, his ideas about it. That's pure. The problem is the straw man that people make of it. There's quite a lot of guided practice. There's quite a lot of unguided practice. There's quite a lot of Q&A. There's quite a lot of feedback. There's quite a lot of discussion. There's recalling things that you have learned or done earlier, and if you don't remember it, to help you what it is. All of those types of things. I think what you're talking about is a caricature. And when you talk about traditional, I mean, I was born and raised the first 20 years of my life in the United States. I went to a high school that had the BSCS, the Biological Sciences Curriculum Study, the PSSC, and the Chem Studies, all progressive teaching aspects in high school. Progressive teaching, between quotation, air quotes. We know that since 1956 with the Sputnik. We're now in 2022. So we're talking about 66 years of what people call progressive. I call traditional, which is good explicit instruction, having people know things before you ask them to solve problems with it, having them understand things before they try to discuss it with others, or form an opinion about it. I call that type of traditional the new progressive. Because what it does is it says, we've now been trying for 66 years. We see that scores are going down. People are learning less. Kids have lower reading scores and lower mathematics scores. Universities are having grade inflation and having problems with professors at the moment because their courses are too hard for the students. Yeah. Which 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they weren't too hard. So the only thing I can say to that is that it's an absurd dichotomy between the two. But one of my tenets is before you ask someone to do something, please try to be very sure that their chance of success will be fairly high. Self-determined and self-regulated learning are okay if that person is capable of self-regulating, and self-determining her or his learning. If you give them the responsibility to do something that they can't do, they'll end up not being able to do it, being frustrated, and that's not my idea of enjoyable learning.
Right.
My view of enjoyable learning is you start on it and you have the idea, hey, I've achieved success, and that the success is also repeatable. So it's not just, like by accident I happened upon it. Yeah.
Right. So, right. Well, again, the sort of ways in which people view education and the priorities of education, I think, is at play here, right? People saying, well, all of the learning is obviously important, but there are other things that are important as well. And I think one of the criticisms, at least as I understand it, is that there's such a focus in I guess your work and the work of the folks that you are sort of quote unquote aligned with, and that's probably not particularly accurate or maybe not even fair, but the idea that
it's not fair.
Right, but on Twitter that's what happens, right? so let's use that as the unfair playing field. The idea that yes, we want kids to learn, but there's much more to school and building of humans, right? And that there's an opportunity cost perhaps with such an extreme focus, if that's a fair characterization, and again maybe it's not, that there are things that were, there are sort of downstream effects of such a narrow focus on efficiency and content and knowledge and learning.
Effectiveness, efficiency, that you learn what you need to learn or learn it more deeply so that you can do things with it. Efficient is so that you're not wasting extra energy doing things that don't help you learning, and enjoyable, that you have a feeling of success and accomplishment after you get it done. Those are the three aspects that are most important for me, because a school is a place to learn. If you want to bring children, raise children, you begin at home. Okay? And I'm not saying the school has no function in it, but at this moment, people are moving it to the extreme that it's the place of the school to raise and
Sure.
I don't know the words anymore in English because they're typical Dutch words, but in order to make them, have them be more polite,
Right. Being more of a proxy
wait
for
each
parents.
other. Yeah, yeah. So they want the school to be a proxy of for the parents. I'm not saying that the school shouldn't do part of that.
Sure.
That's no problem. Yeah, but the primary function of a school is to teach. The primary function or job of a teacher, it's not called teacher for no reason, is to teach. And the primary function of the child being there is to learn. And to learn starting with the fundamentals so that they can read and understand what they're reading, and then give them the opportunity to read broadly and enrich their world. As E.D. Hirsch says, a knowledge-rich curriculum is very, very important in our educating, but also raising our children. If in the United States there was a more knowledge-rich curriculum, I think that some of the wars going on outside of education, I'm talking about your society as a whole, the United States, might not be happening if people would have placed more emphasis on a knowledge-rich curriculum, exposing children to quite a lot and letting them understand it, as opposed to a narrow curriculum, which sometimes when I look at books being banned in the United States is more like indoctrination.
Right. Well, it is interesting. If I'm hearing you correctly, you would characterize the past several decades of education as a pretty heavy lean towards progressive education, right?
What people called at that moment progressive education.
Right.
Of which there's very little empirical research supporting those aspects. Whole word reading, realistic mathematics, pure discovery learning. There's very little, if any, empirical research supporting that it works. There's quite a lot, even by those in aligned with that viewpoint, who are now expounding on the fact that, we actually need to guide that discovery, guiding discovery so much that we actually teach them beforehand, before we let them solve problems and discover. And I say, so explicit instruction, exactly what Baruch Rosenstein told us.
Well, what I find interesting about this sort of quote-unquote argument is that many people in the education space that I see argue that what actually has been happening is quite the opposite, that education could largely be characterized over the past several decades as being much more traditional. And
I don't know what books you're reading, but not from what I've been watching and seeing. Yeah? Right.
Well,
it's just that simple. If we look at it, New Learning, 1996, we're talking about 26 years already, of everything's got to be collaborative.
Right.
We have to do inquiry-based learning because that's the way scientists and engineers acquire new knowledge. Since 1956, the Sputnik, and we decided in the United States, I can say we because at that moment I was there, that decided that that's the way to teach, without any idea of what they're doing is they're placing the epistemology of the expert onto the pedagogy of how one learns. And as Derek Hodgson said in the 80s, I think it was, you have to remember that a scientist does science and a student learns science.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're talking about a pedagogy that's been in place since somewhere between 1956 and 1960. And it's been incrementally increased since then. So actually, I see the movement at the moment from the past now 10, 12 years is kind of saying like, yeah, but how many times Rich Mayer wrote there should be a 3-strike rule in education because inquiry learning has gotten it wrong on different names at least 3 times already.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I hear from lots of educators here in the States and education leaders and voices is that we have been doing too much traditional kind of education, that lecture and not engaging students in different ways. Right.
It's again, all you're doing now is you're presenting it as an exponent of the straw man,
mm-hmm.
because giving a lecture is only one pedagogical technique.
Sure.
That
right.
works.
Right.
Sometimes in some situations, not
right.
always, and that's not the standard.
Right.
And so it'll go too far to say I take offense, but it sounds like you're being the devil's advocate here.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's your intention or not. It's creating and perpetuating the idea of the straw man
mm-hmm.
within this conversation between the two of us. I won't call it a discussion, but I'll call it a conversation, which is, I think, a little bit more neutral than this. It perpetuates that because in one breath saying traditional and the word lecture,
mm-hmm.
that means that the people you're talking about, who you say, actually have no idea what they're talking about.
Right. Okay.
The advocates, the policymakers, they have no idea. And that is often the case. I mean, I used to go to AERA when there was educational research.
Mm-hmm.
There's no longer very much educational research at AERA. It's all about inclusion and inclusive policies and things like that, but not about actually the only thing that has been proven to close the learning gap between the haves and the have-nots is good instruction.
All right.
All the other things have only been shown to increase that gap.
So the work of Edie Hirsch, and I've talked with Natalie Wexler a few times on the podcast, and that resonates with me as well. And I think I agree with you, and I've written as much, saying let's not straw man what is traditional education, direct and explicit instruction. But at the same time, what I have found, and I have become frustrated with, and I know you've talked with him. You were on his podcast, and he was just on ours. And by the time you and our conversation here will have been published, he and my conversation will be published, Zach Groeschel, and we had a really interesting conversation and found lots of common ground. But one of the things I noted to him and find to be a straw man effect as well is that a mischaracterization or conflation and flattening of terms of quote unquote progressive education. Is that inquiry, constructivist, progressive, all of those things are flattened with and associated with discovery learning, of which I say, and when I work with teachers, I say that is not in almost any educational setting what we should be doing, right?
Let's get a couple of things straight, okay? Drew. Constructivist,
mm-hmm.
Constructivism,
right?
Yeah, that's a philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It's a philosophy of what we know
mm-hmm.
and how we know it. Yeah,
yep.
And there's no disputing constructivism. Constructivism is a theory of knowledge,
mm-hmm.
and it means that the way I look at things is different from the way you look at things because I'm shaped by what I've learned and been taught and experienced, and you also are in the exact same situation. Yeah? And so we construct our own realities.
Mm-hmm.
That is constructivism. It's a philosophy.
Okay.
Philosophy you can't prove being true or not true. It's just that simple. Yeah. But it is the case we all construct. That goes back to cognitivism. We create schemas in our head.
Sure.
And we attach new things to things we already know. And if I walk past a room in a school and I look inside and I see all types of bubbling vials of liquid, yeah, I'll look at it because I used to be a chemistry and biology teacher. I'll look at it and say, oh, they're distilling something and they're making use of a water bath. So that means it has to be something that has a point that evaporation point lower than 100 degrees Celsius. If you are a typical English major, yeah,
right.
Nothing wrong with English majors, but probably
lacking the prior knowledge.
Never even had a chemistry course. They'd walk past it, and they had no idea what's happening there. They think it's here's Frankenstein's lab.
Right.
That's constructivism. Yeah. What's in my head is different from your head. Yeah.
Okay.
Discovery learning. Yeah. Depending upon how you look at it, because you can also talk about guided discovery learning. Discovery learning in its purest form means we let the learner discover it for her or himself.
Right.
Which is a fairly ineffective, inefficient way of doing it. I think we should stand on the shoulders of giants.
Right, and I agree.
And make use of the knowledge that has been transmitted to us over generations and generations and generations. That's something that humans can do and very few other animal species can do.
Sure.
We should make use of it.
I
so
agree.
the idea, let them just play and discover it themselves. I would say, well, maybe now as many generations as we have people at this moment, maybe they'll be as far as understanding how light travels. Yeah. We could also start with teaching them how it does it. Yeah. And that there's something called a particle theory and a wave theory, and let them see that, well, if you bend it with magnets, it must be particles, but if you can use slits to polarize it, it must be a wave. Hey, it can be both of them. Let them discover that. That's great. Yeah. But you have to give them first the knowledge in order to do that. I can say, well, here you have a chessboard, solve the chess problem. But it's kind of hard to discover how to beat Bobby Fischer.
Right.
Yeah, I can say it, but if you have no idea of the strategies and tactics and even how the pieces move, you kind of have a problem in doing that.
Sure.
Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with saying to people, hey, here's your basis. Go make use of it. Solve problems. Discover how or why things work. Great. But the idea is you need knowledge to do that. You can't communicate, you can't discuss, you can't solve problems without the necessary knowledge.
Right. Well, okay? And I would agree.
And call it discovery, call it inquiry. If we look at almost all, if not all, and I've written a number of blogs about it, the meta-studies done by people who 20 years ago were pure discovery buffs, if you look at it now and what they're writing and based upon those things, they're saying, yeah, well, you actually need a lot of guidance. So now we're going to study, should we first let them try it without and maybe fail and then give them the guidance, or should we give them the guidance and let them try to do it themselves? And I ask, okay, where's now the discovery in discovery learning?
Right.
You're talking about exactly what Barak Rosenshine is talking about. So I wrote an article with Christina Lund, maybe 20 years ago, that we should stop these wars. Because it's not that one's right or one's wrong. They can be used in different situations. But you have to learn what comes first. And it's not the chicken or the egg, because that's not the question here. Should you first learn the rules of baseball before you start playing baseball?
Right.
Or you should put people out there and have someone run to third base before first, and the next guy coming up going to first base and then running to third, and the next one standing outside of the box and whatever. Maybe you should know something about what you're supposed to do before we ask you to do it.
Right. So I agree with almost everything you say there. What I'm trying to sort of parse out here, and again, one of my frustrations is that discovery learning is conflated often with inquiry learning and often says, well, inquiry teaching and learning doesn't work. because discovery learning doesn't work. And those two things are different in my mind, and there's an important piece that needs to be recognized. And when I talk with teachers and talk with educators, I say there's a valid criticism of inquiry learning insofar as it doesn't include those things that you're mentioning, right? The structure, the guidance, the knowledge, and all of those things. So if we're going to do inquiry teaching and learning, we need to do it well, just like if we need to do direct and explicit instruction well, right? Because there's a way to do that poorly.
Instruction. I try not to use those terms. You're forced into using terms like explicit instruction. I never use direct instruction because that's is a specific form of instruction from Sig Engelman.
Right.
Yeah. But what I'm always talk about is good instruction.
Right.
And sometimes good instruction is just standing there in front of the board going 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 2 is 2. If you want people to automatize that so that they don't have to use a calculator to add 6 and 3 together to find out that it's 9.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes it's making use of the knowledge that you have to carry out a task or solve a problem. And sometimes it's working with others and discussing things with others, depending upon what you want to achieve. And I call it all good instruction. And I don't have a negative connotation to the word instruction.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Instruction is for me something that the teacher does.
Right. But is there a negative connotation to, I guess, the term inquiry teaching?
It depends upon how the person who is a proponent of that defines that.
Right. Right.
For me, a good teacher knows and has a deep conceptual understanding and skills in how people learn. That's one. Let's look at it as a kind of like a Venn diagram.
Right.
Has a complete knowledge, deep knowledge and skills in all of the different, what we would call didactical techniques, but in the United States is called pedagogical techniques, what I would call instructional techniques.
Okay.
And that's everything from giving a lecture and how do you do that, up to how do you design a task for collaborative learning and everything in between it, because I've studied all of those things.
Right.
Yeah. That's the second. So the instructional techniques, the knowledge of how we learn. Yeah. Those are two of the things. The third is the tools that she or he has in order to do it. And that's everything from a microphone for giving a lecture to virtual reality goggles for having people manipulate molecules in the 3D space. So acknowledge that. So the three aspects. The fourth is her or his area of expertise, that a teacher teaching reading really knows. Look at Natalie Wexler, how teaching reading should happen. So that's kind of like at the cusp of knowledge of your subject area and what people would call pedagogical content knowledge. Those 4 or 5 things are what a good teacher can do. I can also say that I could translate that to a good lawyer or a good doctor.
Sure.
Or a good cook in a restaurant, because I used to be a professional cook. And I could do that and say, if you're going to be a top teacher, a top cook, you have to have knowledge and skills in those areas.
Sure.
And instruction, for lack of a better word, you could call it pedagogy, but I'm from Europe, and pedagogy means how you teach children. Andragogy is how you teach adults. Yeah. And pedagogy in the Netherlands means bringing up children, giving them values and morals and things like that, whereas didactics is the instructional techniques that you use for teaching. But okay, those are two different worlds. Those are the aspects that a good teacher should have.
Right.
So that in any given point in time, within a certain situation, within a certain subject, with a certain child, which is having certain problems learning, she or he can choose out of that whole arsenal of pedagogical techniques, tools, contents, based upon knowledge of how a child learns, how our information processing happens, can make the proper choice. That, for me, is good teaching. And it's not giving a lecture, and it's not inquiry learning, and it's not collaborative learning, and it's not whatever you want to think of as different. If you do it right, it's good. If you do it wrong, it's bad.
Right.
It's just that simple.
Right. So, two things, and I want to reference two things that you mentioned. One earlier, you're talking about the current state of, at least here in the States, and I think in many places in the world, sort of our polarized divisiveness, lack of ability to sort of navigate this well. And then also, you mentioned baseball. I was a basketball coach and then more recently soccer, but we can use baseball, even though my expertise there is
I
much
prefer to use soccer, and because I've taught soccer coaches how to make use of explicit instruction to teach their pupils better.
Right. And as a side note, I am actually just recently have become more concerned about my 8th grade daughter's math instruction and lacking explicit instruction, right? And so I do want to make sure that I'm not mischaracterizing or saying, like, I don't believe that that's important, right? Because I do think it's important, and I tell teachers that in the framework of project-based learning and inquiry learning that it is really important, and if you're not doing it, then you're doing your students a disservice, right? So one of the things that I have mentioned on the podcast before, and sort of as a hypothesis that I have, is you go 1983, A Nation at Risk report, which I'm guessing you're familiar with, even though you've been in the Netherlands for quite some time.
I was in the Netherlands for 10 years when that came out.
Okay, yeah. The idea, one of the things that strikes me is that as a result of that kind of mindset, a shift towards we have got to get on the stick with education to compete with, the powers that be that are outside, Russia and all those kinds of things, is that we shifted or incentivized education practices that were more geared towards teaching towards a test, right? To getting scores, a culture of achievement, I would talk about, which, and I think you mentioned in either in these books or in your work, or both places, is you find some problems with that sort of mindset as well, right? But what it has, I think, disincentivized, or it seems intuitively true to me. I'm not a researcher like you, so I don't have the empirical data here, but that the teachers that might give students an opportunity to have some more of that Socratic back and forth, one might characterize it as sort of inquiry. We have not practiced for several decades those skills of encountering different ideas, challenging ideas, asking hard questions, and those kinds of things, because we have been more narrowly focused and incentivized in a way that that is geared towards that test prep mindset. And so when I talk about teaching and learning, go back to the sports analogy, soccer, right? So when I coach, and I was coaching my daughter up until recently, who's now 8th grade, 13, one of the things that I did do was, even with the littlest ones, to say, what are the things we need to know? Like, first of all, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to win games, have fun, enjoy the experience, learn all these things, right? And that is developmentally different as they get older, right? Maybe more competitive, less competitive, whatever. But let's identify what it is that we need to know and learn in order to do that, right? One of those things, of course, is the rules, right? Yeah. So, and how to kick, how to dribble, how the game works, all those things. But one wouldn't say, all right, before we get out on the field, I'm going to tell you all the rules, and we're going to study them and make sure that you're mastering those. It's not a linear thing, right? It's contextualizing. I often give an
example, and I use soccer as, we call it football, the uncivilized world.
Right.
Football. Yeah. The Brits invented it, and they called it football.
Right.
Okay, and so we call it football too. I
use that term with my friends around here, and they laugh at me, but that's okay.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing you do with a football in the United States is punt it or kick it off, and for the rest you just throw it and catch it.
Right.
So I don't understand what the foot part of football is in the United States, but okay.
Right.
I give an example of let's say your daughter. Okay. And she's been watching good football, and she's seen Messi bend it,
Mm-hmm.
And she's seen David Beckham bend the ball with a free kick.
Yep.
Yeah. And she wants to bend it like Beckham. There was a film called Bend It Like Beckham.
Yep.
Yeah. And so she puts out those defenders. Yeah. And she puts that 9 meters away, however many feet that is, I have no idea,
Right.
Away from where the ball is. And she has to say, I want to be this.
Right.
And she kicks the ball and goes into the defender.
Right.
And she kicks the ball and goes into the defender. And she kicks the ball. This is someone who's doing deliberate practice. She really wants to do it.
Yep.
Yeah? And it goes in. And she thinks, but it has to go around them. So she kicks it to the side, right or left. But it doesn't go anywhere near the goal.
Right.
Because she's just kicked it straight to the left or to the right of the defenders. Okay? And you come there as a coach. And you go up to your daughter or a friend of your daughter. And you say, well, if you plant, let's say she's right-footed.
Mm-hmm.
If you plant your left foot and just hit it with the side of your foot, it'll start to curve. And you can if you want to say, well, you see this ball, it's not completely round, and because of that, it catches air pressure, and you put a spin on it, and it does. You don't have to. You can say it, but you don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
But you do that, and damn it, the ball begins to curve. And it might have curved while she was doing it by herself. She had no idea what she was doing. Mm-hmm. So the next time she kicked the ball, it went into the wall again. All of a sudden, it starts to curve. And she said, hey. And she practices that. And she, with this idea of, well, I have to do it with the side of my foot. She experiments a little bit, and she has it with more towards her toes or more towards her ankle or whatever to get more or less spin on it. And you go up to it and you say at a certain point, hey, did you notice that when you were doing it this way, you got more of a curve in it than that? So maybe you should plant your left leg a little bit further in front so that you can get more of a curve on. Right. Okay? And eventually you also want the ball to go over the defender and go down. Yeah? Which means there's a different spin necessary. Mm-hmm. And you say, well, now, okay, you got this curve in it, great. But now what you need to do is put your foot more under the ball so that you get a different rotation so that when it goes past the defenders, it starts to curve down into the goal. Now, if you didn't do that, your daughter, after 1 or 2 or 3 days and having a completely worn out right leg, would decide, free kicks aren't for me. I can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Maybe.
Well, maybe. I mean, if she's tried 3 days in a row and an hour to an hour and a half every time, and it still doesn't work, the chance is great that that person thinks, I can't do it.
Okay.
But if you've given that child good instruction,
right,
yeah, and the ball curves and it begins to drop and things like that, the child gets the idea of, number one, it's more effective. Mm-hmm. It's achieving what you wanted to achieve. Mm-hmm. It's efficient. It's a lot easier than learning it by yourself without any instruction. Mm-hmm. And it's enjoyable because you have this feeling of accomplishment. I can curve the ball. I can be the free kick specialist. I can win the game.
Right.
Yeah, for my team. We've given that child explicit instruction. We've allowed her quite a lot of practice time, quite a lot of discovery time, but we've given her the fundamentals. We haven't discussed the physics and the Bernoulli effect and why things, when they have a certain curve, have drag and flow and do that. You can do that later if you want to integrate physics into it. But you've given good, explicit instruction, and that child has the idea, your daughter has the idea, I can do it. I can be the free kick specialist.
So I think this is
That's what I'm talking about.
Right.
And I didn't explain to her what being offside is, right, and that you have to throw the ball in with 2 hands over your head with your feet next to each other if you're throwing in.
Sure.
I didn't explain all of that to her.
Right. So I think this is actually a really good example. So the way that I might approach that, and I'm curious how you think about this, is to really lean heavily into inquiry there, perhaps, and very likely, because I think there's a way to do that instruction in a way that can be framed as questions that might help deepen.
But that's what I'm talking. That is
okay.
Explicit instruction.
Okay.
If I walk up to her and I say to her, "You hit the ball with this, and you saw that, and now you hit it this way, and you saw that. Why do you think that's happened?"
Right. What might
that's
make
for me
it do this?
A dialogue. Yeah.
Right.
And if you look at what Barak Rosenshine says, and he's not that he's God or something else, he's going to say checking for understanding, inquiring, having a dialogue with the student. If you look at his 10 or 17, depending on which pamphlet you're looking at, that's a part of it. That's explicit instruction. That's just telling someone you do it this way.
Right.
But it's an interaction. When I teach my granddaughter how to cross the road, yeah, we have a complete discussion of why we first have to look left and then right and then left before crossing, because I've understood she knows what differences between a red light and a green light, and she's experienced, and I've discussed with her people who go through red lights and green lights and why it's so important to look left and right. And at a certain point I say, okay, it's now your turn. Can we cross the road? Yeah. What do we have to do? You have to do this, that, and the other. Okay, let's go. Give me your hand. You take the lead.
So how do we make that point there more, not to use a pun here, explicit to people who are thinking through this? Because what I see from, let's just say, the camp of Paul Kirschner, right, which again is unfair, is that inquiry is not good and it's not effective, and that effective instruction often actually doesn't include that inquiry.
Way. Teaching based upon pure inquiry is not effective, not efficient, and often not enjoyable.
Including characterized as discovery.
I forgot the word I was going to use. Making use of questioning, discussion, what you might call inquiry, as part of the learning process, as being useful at a certain point, judging on the fact that the knowledge is there to make a useful inquiry by the learner,
right?
And that when you ask the question, that you don't get just a blank stare back,
right?
Because that person doesn't have the background knowledge,
right?
That's poor inquiry.
I would agree.
If person has the background knowledge and has experienced it, and you say, "Hey, you've seen when you approach it this way, this, and when you approach it that way, that happens," yeah, knowing that the prior knowledge is available to give a useful answer to the question you're posing, that's great. But that's, for me, part of explicit instruction.
Right.
That means you first make sure that before you have someone do something with information, that the person has the knowledge to be able to do it. Maybe not 100% of the time. Nobody is capable of it.
Right.
But you have an inkling in the idea that person is equipped to do what I ask her or him to do successfully.
Right.
And then afterwards to discuss it with her or him, that it's not only doing it, but understanding it and learning about it.
Well, this is
That's what I call good instruction.
Yeah, as would I. And this is something, and I know you know Catherine Burble-Singh, and
We can continue, but I'm just saying we've hit the hour.
Oh, I'm at 53 here. I've got just a couple more things if that's okay.
But you're not talking about extreme if you go about Catherine Burble-Singh, and I'm not going to talk about colleagues of mine. I never discuss their names or things like that.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say she's been on my podcast, and actually I had a chance to meet her, and we had dinner in New York and talking about this, right?
Great person.
Yeah, wonderful. I wish I'd been able to spend more time with her. And I'm frustrated with people who attack her and Michaela, and she and I have some differences in how we think about education, although not as much as I think we do, or many people would think we do. To say she's not doing great things for kids is absurd. But so here's the thing that one of the things that I really think is important for our kids to learn as kids and then become adults and successful adults is to be able to identify what we might need to know and learn in order to do something well. Not just do it, but do it well. Right? And so the way that I approach helping teachers do project-based learning is to frame it with that as the core piece, right? To say, what if we have a challenge and a driving question, and clarity of product, purpose, and audience, and all those things, but then say, how do we identify with significant teacher help, and oftentimes modeling as a good teacher does, identifying those questions that we need to know and learn in order to do that. And of course, they don't know how to ask questions. They can't ask great questions about something of which they know very little, right? So you create some context and you create some background knowledge or activate prior knowledge, those kinds of things in some sort of entry event, and begin to scratch the surface. Sometimes it's different in a project, and sometimes they have more background knowledge or whatever, but let's assume they don't know much about it. So you create some context and you start to scratch the surface, and then you dig a little deeper and dig a little deeper. One of the things that I find to be perhaps lacking in lots of our instruction in schools is the practice of that ability, and thus we get people who are adults who can't identify those important things.
Yeah. But the problem, and I won't say the reason for that is, but the idea is you want people to be able to do that.
Right.
But that means you have to set up a curriculum in such a way that you, at the moment it's possible, you decrease the scaffolding, the support and guidance, so that the person starts to be able to do it her or himself.
Right.
Yeah. In my book, 10 Steps to Complex Learning, that I wrote with Jeroen van Merrienboer, we discussed that in the third edition, in chapter 13 or chapter 14, how you actually build that in so that self-study, the ability to know what you know what you don't know, to stimulate the metacognition about it.
Right.
We talk about that. I mean, that book says as a basic tenet, we start with the simplest form of the whole task. That's what you were talking about, scratching the surface.
Right.
Yeah. You start with the simplest form of it. Least complex is the better way of saying it. And you give the scaffolding that you need. And as you see that the child is capable of doing it her or himself, reduce the scaffolding until they can do it. And then you add complexity to the situation. And go through that again and again and again, constantly adding, step at a time, new complexity, constantly allowing that student to understand what he or she can and cannot do and why, so that the person is capable of doing.
Right.
What the problem is, I think, is that people want to do it and immediately give the learner the responsibility of doing it.
Right.
Sees that person can't do it, steps in for 100% and guides it completely, and then is amazed after years of doing that the person isn't self-sufficient.
Right.
Yeah. I've learned through years and years of doing research and teaching that we should not ask a learner to do something that she or he can't do. If you look at retrieval practice, I'll give one small example, and I won't be long. Retrieval practice is, instead of rereading something, you have to get it from your long-term memory and do something with it.
Right.
Okay? You would think that writing a summary of something, reading something or listening to a lecture and writing a summary of that, or an abstract, would be the best type of retrieval practice you can think of. It's not asking the question to remember what date Christopher Columbus landed at Hispaniola or whatever. You're asking them to be generative in what's in their long-term memory and make something new, a summary of it, using retrieval practice. Sounds great.
Right.
We did that. We studied it, and we found it didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So what did we do? After that, we looked at the summaries that these high school juniors had written, and they were horrible. They had once learned in a course how to write a summary. They might have practiced it once or twice. In the American situation, I'd say, in an English lesson.
Mm-hmm.
In the Netherlands, it would be in a Dutch lesson, because that's our primary language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It was never used again. The biology teacher never asked them to write a summary and never checked whether they did it well. The history teacher never did that also. The art appreciation teacher never did that or anything. But teachers assume, and we as researchers assumed, that a child who's 16, 17 years old and is a junior in high school is capable of writing a summary. We gave that child the responsibility to do something that she or he was taught once, had never really practiced, and couldn't do. Now, we could assume that the child is stupid, but the fact of the matter is, we as teachers did not constantly hone their capability of writing a summary. And I can say the same thing for making a concept map. How does a child know what the most important things are in a text if the person doesn't know anything about
right
about that, and what a directional arrow means and things like that? And if the teacher doesn't do it with them and then check what they've done and then get into a dialogue with them, is why did you choose this as an important word? What is this word maybe more important or less important, or why, and things like that. If you don't do that, you're giving them a responsibility, and then you can say, yeah, well, the concept maps don't work. They're beautiful. They're all different types of colors with all different types of things, but the child doesn't learn from.
Right.
So never, the whole thing is, don't give a child, a learner, responsibility to do things that she or he can't do. If you're saying it's self-regulated learning, that means that the person for self-regulation has to be able to make a plan, monitor progress, evaluate whether that person is closer to achieving what she or he will do, and then decide whether or not to go into that cycle again.
Right.
If you absolutely know absolutely nothing about the area, you cannot plan, you cannot monitor, you cannot evaluate. So let's not ask children to be self-regulated learners until we've created the boundary conditions necessary to have them self-regulate their own learning, and help them then learn to self-regulate their own learning. Help them learn what type of questions do I have to ask myself to monitor my own progress.
Right. Well,
those types of things, and that's called good instruction.
Right, and
to learn to metacognition and to self-regulate your own learning.
Right, I agree, and consistently when we're working with teachers, again, on project-based learning, and saying, look, don't say, here's your challenge and I'll see you in 3 weeks, and let's hope you've learned some things, and you know, I joke about it as being free-range chicken, right? It's just a nonsensical way to go about it. So it must be really structured. You have clarity of the cognitive path you want them to travel. You want to have those scaffolds. You want to have those direct instruction pieces, explicit instruction, guided instruction, whatever you want to say, right?
I use the word good instruction.
Right.
And I often call it explicit instruction.
Right. And one of the things we talk about in a piece of our project-based learning model is autonomy, right? And we say, look, don't try to think that you are supposed to give your kids 100% autonomy, right? If you're a Spinal Tap fan, you say, turn that knob up to 11, right? No, there are developmental levels that relate to complexity of task and what they're doing and what they know. So you've got to scaffold it appropriately. I say, I would not have given my 3-year-old a sharp knife and asked her to cut a tomato. but I would when she's 13, if she could handle that. I might give her a butter knife and ask her to cut butter at age 3, right? So there are those things. But to me, one of the things again that I really want to emphasize is how do we use the work that you and your colleagues have done and are continue to do, and not mischaracterize it as not including inquiry. Learn. But that's kind of the message, and some people are just not going to hear it because that you're the enemy, right? And
I know
that's a problem. That's a different problem to solve. But on the other side, how do we use? Because like when I talk with John Hattie, he says, obviously, explicit instruction works and inquiry doesn't. Discovery learning has a small effect size, but he would recognize, and I think you've recognized in some of your work, that when done really well with lots of effective scaffolding and instruction, that inquiry kinds of learning, which is what I would call good inquiry, it can be,
which I would call good instruction.
Right. So that's
I don't want to use if there are certain words which trigger a certain reaction.
Right.
Don't use it. Call it good instruction.
Okay.
Call inquiry one of the pedagogical techniques that you can make use of, that a good teacher knows when and how to make use of.
Yeah.
Just like a good teacher knows when and how to give a good lecture.
Yeah.
And knows when and how to create a good problem for problem-based learning.
Right.
And call it just good instruction. And if you want to get rid of the idea of wars and the dichotomy, you have to get rid of the terminology that feeds those wars.
Right.
And what I hear you say when you say good inquiry, what you're actually talking about is good instruction, making use of inquiry as a pedagogical or instructional technique within that good instruction, that good teaching.
Right.
That's what I want a teacher to do.
Yeah. And
no more, no less.
Right. Fair enough. And I think that's maybe a good place to come to an end. As a former psychology teacher, my dad was a psychologist, my mom was a teacher, and I was a psychology teacher. This is a wonderful playground for me, right? So I could talk about this for hours and hours, but let's make sure that we wrap up. If there's anything you wanted to talk about or say that you haven't, any links and resources you want to share, I'll make sure that folks have the links to the books in the show notes. I know you're on Twitter, which is where the world happens, but
yeah. I think if I'm closing, I'd say before you're critical of something, make sure you have the knowledge to know what you're critical of. Critical thinking is very important.
Absolutely.
But without knowledge, you can't think critically. You can criticize, but you can't think critically. And my experience, in any event, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, is that teachers at teacher training colleges aren't equipped with the knowledge that they need to think critically about teaching and learning. Sorry to have to say that. And policymakers know nothing, usually.
Right.
Yeah? So we should get them completely out of the equation. Be critical based upon knowledge, but don't criticize what you think you might know or what you think is the case. First, get the basic knowledge that you need to critically think, and then think critically. That would be my closing statement.
Yeah, well, and that resonates with me. I was thinking about the issue of critical thinking. Like you go to a doctor, you don't want your doctor to just be on autopilot following the steps and the diagnosis. You want them to be able to think critically, or an auto mechanic. You want them to have
a knowledge of anatomy and physiology and pathology and biology, and make use of that along with the techniques that she or he has, and the tools, giving penicillin with a pill or in a needle or whatever. Yeah, you want the exact same thing that I said about teachers.
Right.
I could say about doctors. That's what you want when you go to a doctor. That's what you should want when you go to a teacher. Right.
And again, I think your two books are a great resource and tool to think more deeply about the practices of education. Certainly some other ones out there as well. But Paul, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're a busy person, so thanks so much for the time and the conversation. And perhaps and hopefully we'll be able to do it again sometime.
In a case of one-upsmanship, you went to dinner with Catherine. I rode her around the streets of Amsterdam on the back of my bicycle.
Yeah, she told me.
Yeah, her screaming the whole time.
Well, maybe at some point the three of us.
I love Catherine.
Yeah, maybe the three of us can convene sometime and the
Sounds like a good idea. Let's do that.
You can gang up on me.
Okay, let's do that. Take care, Drew.
All right.
Bye-bye.